Okay, I'll just launch right in then. So thanks everyone. My talk today is on climate change. It's entitled Food, Farms, Climate, and the Future, 8 things people need to know and 8 policies that we need. So I'm just going to walk you through some background information on climate change, and then I'm going to delve into 8 government policies that we need in order to support farmers' efforts to reduce emissions and to make their farms more resilient to the coming climate change. So 8 things that you should know about the climate crisis in agriculture. Number 1, carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere are going up, and they're going up very fast. This graph shows 800,000 years of carbon dioxide concentrations in Earth's atmosphere. You can see over that 800,000 year period that CO2 emission concentrations went up and they went down. The low periods in this graph actually correspond to what we call ice ages. Just to give you a sense of how much time we're looking at here, 800,000 years is 4 times longer than human beings have existed, and this is 160 times longer than human civilization has existed. This is a very, very long period of time. So just to highlight a few things about this graph of CO2 concentrations. One, clearly we're looking at the highest levels in 800,000 years at least, and it turns out it's the highest level in a million years or longer. Second thing I want to point out is notice over that period of time, the concentrations went up and the concentrations went down, but not once did they peak higher than 300 parts per million. You'll see now they're at about 417 parts per million. So they are really at levels that are unprecedented over the last million years. And the last thing I'll point out is just how fast they're rising. Down at the bottom here, I hope you can see my cursor. Down at the bottom here, we're below 200 parts per million. And then over a period of time of about 10,000 years, between that period and 1900, they rose about 100 parts per million. That took 10,000 years. But notice between 1900 and the current time, another approximately 100 years, they went up another 100 parts per million. So the first 100 parts per million took 10,000 years. The next took just 100. So what we're seeing is concentrations rising about 100 times faster than what we'd normally see in the historic record. So clearly it's tough to look at a graph like that and conclude anything other than this is a human-caused phenomenon, and it is very, very dramatic and happening very, very quickly. So that's carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. As many of you will know, there are 3 main greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is one, methane is another, and nitrous oxide is the third. And agriculture is a significant source of all 3. Carbon dioxide, farms produce that when we burn fuel, in our tractors, trucks, when we burn natural gas to heat our homes and barns and shops. And also if you're in a place like Saskatchewan where they burn coal to produce electricity and natural gas to produce electricity, those emissions also produce carbon dioxide. So the second main greenhouse gas is methane. This is a graph of methane concentrations in the atmosphere. It's over a shorter time span, not 800,000 years, but instead 10,000. Methane is a greenhouse gas that is very powerful, 28 times more powerful than CO2 when it comes to warming. The main sources of methane in the atmosphere are oil and gas production, landfills, manure, and rice paddy agriculture. So you can see what's happened with methane concentrations in the atmosphere for most of the last 10,000 years. They're relatively stable. And then around 1800 or 1900, they began spiking upward quite dramatically and have nearly tripled the concentrations in the atmosphere. The third main greenhouse gas is nitrous oxide, extremely powerful. It's about 265 times more powerful than CO2 when it comes to trapped heat. This is the concentration in the global atmosphere over the last 800,000 years. And the main source for nitrous oxide is nitrogen fertilizer. So all three of the main greenhouse gases are increasing quite rapidly in the atmosphere. They all cause warming. So not surprisingly, the temperatures in the atmosphere and even in the oceans are going up. This is a graph of what's happened over the last 140 years, the variation from the late 20th century normal. And you can see that variation is gone past half a degree and is closing in on 1 degree. And in some years, in some months rather, the anomaly is actually pushing 1.5 degrees. So we've got quite rapid temperature increases, where in the past, temperature increases of this magnitude would take centuries or thousands of years. Instead, we're seeing this happen in decades. And I should say, just in terms of temperatures, where we are in Saskatchewan, the projection is that we could see 6.4 degrees of warming by the end of the century. So almost 1 degree per decade, about 6.5 degrees over the next 8 decades. So that's a quick tour of what's happening in the atmosphere and what that's doing to temperatures. I want to turn now to look at agricultural emissions from our farms. This is a graph of data from Saskatchewan. If you've read the tackling report, you've seen a graph like this, but that's Canadian data. This is data more specific to Saskatchewan. It's a complicated looking graph, but what I want to point out at this point is just a couple of things. First of all, the top line. This is the total amount of emissions from Saskatchewan agriculture. It's up about 50% since 1990, and the trend line is still fairly strongly upward. Second thing I want to point out is the increase is driven by nitrogen fertilizer. If you look at those blue bands at the bottom, there's 2 of them. The dark blue band is nitrogen fertilizer use, nitrous oxide emissions from fields when nitrogen is applied. And the light blue band, the lighter blue band is carbon dioxide emissions from nitrogen fertilizer factories. And in preparing this, I'll show you in a second just how much the use of nitrogen has gone up. I suspect that this actually understates the case because, as I'll show you in a minute, nitrogen fertilizer use over this period has actually quadrupled, but the emissions have only doubled, according to the federal government. So one of the questions I'm going to put to the federal government is, how can it be that, given that we've quadrupled fertilizer use over this period, the emissions have only doubled? So we may get some revised figures from the government, or at least have a discussion around methodology. But again, the increase in greenhouse gas emissions from Saskatchewan farms is wholly driven by increasing emissions from nitrogen fertilizer. So when we look into the future at a time when emissions are going to have to go down to meet our Paris commitments or the more recent commitments to make Canada greenhouse gas neutral, get to net zero by 2050, clearly we're going to have to look at nitrogen. You can see in this graph, we're about 22 million tons. Fully half of that is related to nitrogen fertilizer use. So this is the data for nitrogen tonnage on Saskatchewan farms. It covers about the last 50 years. Note that farmers have quadrupled nitrogen use over the last 30 years. And as many of you will know, nitrogen is it's a fossil fuel product. It is probably the largest single energy input into agriculture. If you've seen one of my talks before, you've heard me note that the energy in 1 ton of nitrogen fertilizer, by the time it gets onto your field, is equal to 2 tons of gasoline. And in doing work on nitrogen fertilizer, and I'm going to do a long report for the NFU, I hope within the next 12 months focus just on nitrogen, because it is such a driver of energy use and emissions. But in doing work on nitrogen, I came to understand that nitrogen fertilizer is unique amongst all the processes and products that humanity produces, in that nitrogen fertilizer is a major source of all three of the major greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide in its production, nitrous oxide in its use, and methane from its natural gas feedstock. So there's probably no other product or process that manages to tick all three boxes when it comes to the major greenhouse gases. So that's the sixth thing that you should know about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. Out of the 8, the 7th is that sequestration won't save us. A lot of people, the Saskatchewan government among them, really want to focus on sequestration. Sequestration is real and important, and getting more carbon and soil organic matter into the soil is absolutely critical for soil health, reducing erosion, water holding, climate change resilience, all of those things. But it isn't a significant climate change solution or emission reduction measure. And this graph is from Agriculture Canada. And what it shows is various years, the emissions from agriculture and the greenhouse gas carbon sequestration. So the emissions are the gray-brown bars pointing upward, and sequestration is those gold bars pointing downward. So a couple of things there. One, emissions are significantly larger than sequestration. And two, sequestration is decreasing as we move forward in time. In 2020, it's about 8 million tons. By 2030, it'll be maybe 5 million tons, and it'll trail off towards zero. What's happening here is as the decades go on, the soil reaches a new equilibrium. You can't continue to put carbon into soil without limits. And one of the ways you can think about that is the prairie soils where we farm, there was a certain amount of carbon in those soils when the Europeans first came here and broke the prairie. And that amount of carbon was the result of bison rotationally grazing on unbroken, deep-rooted grassland for 10,000 years. And that represents really the maximum amount of carbon we can realistically get into the soils in the prairies. There's nothing that we can do in terms of cropping systems or grazing systems that can really push a lot more carbon into those soils than those bison managed in 10,000 years. So there are maximums, and the soil, it's not a technical term, but the soils eventually fill up, reach a new equilibrium. So the last of the 8 points in terms of climate change and emissions is that the systems that are high emission tend also to be low income, low net income, and low margin. So some of you have seen graphs like this for Canada. This is the Saskatchewan specific data. This is a graph showing the last 93 years, I think it is, almost a century of Saskatchewan gross farm revenue. That's the black line that goes up. And Saskatchewan net farm income, that's the gray line that doesn't go up. Both lines are adjusted for inflation, so you can make meaningful comparisons between the current period and the 1930s or 50s or 70s. And both lines have government subsidies subtracted so that those taxpayer-funded support programs don't mask or obscure what's happening in the market. So the top line is the revenues that farmers get from the markets when they sell grains and oil seeds and livestock, etc. And the bottom line is what farmers have left from the markets after they pay all their bills. So I'll just add a line in here to highlight where zero is. I'll color in the years of positive net income in green, the years of negative net income in red, and the gap between the two in blue. And that gap again is what farmers are paying for expenses, their inputs, and you can see those inputs are consuming a larger and larger share. And what we say in our tackling report is that really the emissions problem in agriculture is caused by an overdependence on farm inputs, that farmers farmed for 10,000 years and they didn't affect the atmosphere or the climate. And it's only in the last 100 years that as farmers have become more and more dependent on purchased inputs, that emissions have gone up. But the other thing that's happened over the last 100 years, as farmers have become more and more dependent on purchased inputs, and that blue section has risen, the other thing that's happened is farmers' margins and their net incomes have gone down. You can see in recent years, net incomes have come back up, but they're now, for the last 4 years, have been trending downward again. And there's some danger that they might intersect zero in the coming years. So just to show you what farmers get to keep, between the end of the Depression and 1985, farmers were keeping about 43 cents out of every dollar. Starting in 1986 to current, the average has been about 6 cents out of every dollar. So farmers' emissions are going up and margins are going down. So those are the 8 things that give us kind of a grounding, the background that we can use then to start to develop policies. Am I still coming through okay? Should I proceed to the next part? Am I still coming through okay?
Sounds good.
Still good? Okay.
Sound great.
Thank you. So based on that brief analysis, let's just now look at some policies that we could ask government for that would support farmers' efforts to reduce emissions and also build resilience in the face of the coming climate change. So first, we've got to start with nitrogen. As I said before, nitrogen in Saskatchewan is responsible for nearly half of the emissions. So we can do 3 things when it comes to nitrogen. We can use it more efficiently, we can use less of it, and we can produce it without emissions. So in terms of efficiency, we can employ what's called the 4R best management practices. So we can use the right product or formulation, put it in the right place, in the right amount, and at the right time. So really optimize where it's put, how much we use, and when it's applied. Those efficiency measures can reduce nitrogen fertilizer use by as much as 30% without affecting yield. But efficiency isn't enough. I talked to one of the developers of the 4R techniques, and he just volunteered. He said, efficiency alone won't reduce use, because if fertilizer is used more efficiently, you get more bang for your buck. Farmers might just decide to invest in even more of it and increase use. So we also need, independent of those efficiency measures to reduce use. So some of the things that can do that would be independent soil testing to help farmers better understand their needs rather than relying on fertilizer sellers and input companies. Give farmers independent arm's length testing. Maybe put a small tax on fertilizer, maybe 2%, and reinvest that money in fertilizer reduction research. So put some money into helping farmers find ways to get the same yields using less fertilizer, and maybe even reduction targets. There might have to be a program from government working with farmers to say, look, we've got to use less nitrogen fertilizer. We've got to reduce that by X% per year. How are we going to do that? And finally, we probably need to produce our nitrogen without emissions. So either hooking those nitrogen fertilizer plants up to renewable energy, or at the very least capturing the carbon the carbon dioxide that comes out of those plants, carbon capture and sequestration. A couple of plants in the United States have done that. We need to diversify our cropping approaches. We need more complex rotations. We need to look at cover crops, intercropping, etc. We need to multiply the number of organic farms and the organic acres. Per acre, organic farms have lower emissions. We need to look at other production systems, agroecology, holistic management, permaculture, etc. not rely so much on these high input conventional systems. And we need to maximize the number of farmers on the land to increase resilience and adaptability. Right now, we're on a track to dramatically reduce the number of farmers out there. And if you think about the challenges of climate change, probably the best thing we could do would be to maximize the number of people we have on the landscape, using their judgment, observing what's happening, tailoring farming systems to the climate, to the weather, to the soil type, to the place that they're in. And going down the road we are now, where we have ever larger farms and very little time to manage individual fields and acres, probably isn't a good idea in the face of the rapidly changing climate we're going to live in. One of the things the NFU has proposed is something that we call MINT agriculture, minimum input no-till. And essentially, MINT agriculture takes as granted the idea that most of the acres are still going to be farmed by non-organic farmers. And what we need to do is we need to create a hybrid system that takes the best ideas from organic agriculture and the best ideas from no-till and fuse them together to try and come up with a system that minimizes emissions per acre and per ton. So organic farmers are really great at figuring out how to get fertility without buying purchased fertilizer, especially nitrogen. So I think that's something that all farmers are going to need to learn a lot more about if we're going to reduce emissions. So it's a hybrid system that takes the best soil building and emissions reduction from organic and fuses that with the soil building and conserving practices from no-till. It isn't organic. It would use some fertilizer to deal with fertility constraints. It would use some chemicals to deal with problem weeds, etc. But it would sort of seek to answer the question, what does a cropping system look like if we want to minimize the greenhouse gas emission tonnage per ton of grain output? Another thing we need to do is we need to look at fuel switching and efficiency. So as much as possible, we need to electrify everything, because electricity can be a low emission energy source. So we need to electrify water heating and building heat as it becomes possible. We need to electrify trucks and tractors and other farm equipment. We need to look at battery electric tractors, developing those. The three tractors along the right-hand side of this slide are, I think the top and the bottom ones are prototypes. I think the middle one is actually available from a company based in the United States. We need to maximize the installation of on-farm solar arrays and other low-emission energy sources. Perhaps we need to look at manure biodigesters, although there's some challenges with those in cold climates. And we don't want to do things like promote mega barns and industrial agriculture, but in some places it might make sense to install biodigesters that capture methane and turn that into heating fuel or electricity. We prioritize farm buildings and homes for energy efficient retrofits so that we can heat using less energy. And on new buildings, we need to move really quickly to really increase the building codes, either LEED or passive house or net zero, because the buildings we build now are going to be around for 50, 100, maybe 200 years. And we've got to really improve those buildings because they're going to be around for so long. Cattle, it's those of you who read the tackling report know that that there's a real balance that has to be struck on cattle. Cattle emit methane when they eat grass, but they also provide a lot of benefits in terms of maintaining healthy biodiverse grasslands, producing manure for mixed farms and sort of closing nutrient cycles and providing economic diversification. So we need to maximize the soil building potential of these animals and their contribution to grassland ecosystems, but at the same time, we need to tackle the methane problem. Again, this is that same graph I showed you before, Saskatchewan greenhouse gas emissions. I just bring it up again here so you can kind of see where cattle fit into this. The dark green band near the top is enteric methane. That's methane from the mouths, mostly of cattle. they produce that when they eat grass. It would be more convenient if it was the case that the big problem was cattle in feedlots, but really when it comes to methane, cattle on grass. Having said that, cattle in feedlots consume grain, and that grain is produced with nitrogen fertilizer, and that has its own emissions. So the dark green is enteric methane from the mouths of cattle, and the light green is manure management. So methane and nitrous oxide from cattle, hog, and other manure. So in terms of cattle, I think we need to change not only what we do, but sort of the goals that we have. So for instance, we need to really focus on the goal of soil building and increasing soil carbon levels. So what we need there is to put animals on grass and utilize the best possible grazing methods, things like rotational grazing, holistic management, etc. We want to maximize the number of sustainable livelihoods, so we probably want to raise those cattle on as many small and medium-sized dispersed production units as possible. We want to maximize the enjoyment from meat consumption, so we should focus more on excellence and quality and not so much on commodity beef and drive-through meals. We want to maximize the supply of food for humans, so in that scenario, you probably want those livestock eating wastes or grazing on non-arable land and not eating grain that could otherwise feed humans. And we want to maximize the chance of reducing methane emissions. So we probably want fewer animals, less meat consumption. We want to raise them as efficiently as possible, but that in no way entails that we would go nearly as far as what some extreme positions are, and that is dramatically reduce or eliminate cattle from the landscape. The sixth policy that we could look at could be set-aside programs. We might want to take 5 to 10% of cropland out of production, use that to grow trees, to create wildlife habitat, to restore wetlands, etc. This would have a couple of benefits. You get soil organic matter increase from the grass and the grazing. You'd get a reduction in emissions because people wouldn't be fertilizing it and driving tractors across it. And because you're using it for wetlands restoration and habitat, you can slow the rate of extinction. Seventh policy measure, we could look at what we call a super PFRA, the Canadian Farm Resilience Authority, the CFRA. And the CFRA could just fulfill a number of roles in agriculture as you move forward with emissions reduction and climate change resilience. They could manage independent soil testing. They could help with the research for fertilizer reduction. They could oversee the set-aside programs, help proliferate the grazing, best management practices, etc. And they could just generally oversee the technical aspects of a transition to low-emission, climate-compatible agriculture. The last policy we'll highlight here today is a carbon tax and refund system. The details of that are in the tackling report, but essentially it just takes seriously the power imbalance between farmers and agribusiness, and it would collect carbon taxes up and down the agri-food chain, but acknowledge that all of those taxes would in one way or another be passed back to farmers, and farmers would be the ultimate payers. So they would rebate the entire amount collected to farmers. The average farmer would be revenue neutral, come out neither money ahead nor behind. Farmers who took steps to reduce emissions by reducing fertilizer use, by employing mixed farming to cycle nutrients, by finding, by going organic, etc. Those farmers that had below average emissions would end up money ahead. So it would transfer money from those that had high emission systems to those that had lower emission systems, and it would thereby help farmers invest in emission reduction. So just to recap the policies, in terms of nitrogen, we need to use it more efficiently, we need to use less of it, and we need to produce it without emissions. For cropping, we need to diversify, adopt more complex rotations, utilize cover crops, move to organics and agroecology. We need to develop hybrid systems that minimize emissions per ton. On fuel and energy, we need to electrify everything possible and use energy much, much more efficiently. For cattle, we need to maximize the benefits, especially soil building, while reducing the methane emissions and reducing numbers. For land use, we need to look at about a 5 to 10% set-aside program. We need new institutions such as the CFRA, and we need to utilize price signals, perhaps a carbon tax and refund system. That's my talk. I'd be very happy to take questions. Again, as was mentioned, a lot of details are in the Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis report. And for kind of a big 10,000-year look at some of these issues around agriculture and emissions, there's a couple chapters in the Civilization Critical book that I released last year that looks at that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Darrin. That's great. We'll go back to the screen where we can see each other, and I'm invite people to ask Darrin questions or to make points. It's listed on the agenda as a discussion time, so a question and answer or discussion time. For effectiveness on hearing as many people as possible, if you could keep your contribution to 2 minutes at the very most, that would be great, preferably less. Be as concise as you can. And keeping in mind that according to our schedule, our next speaker is at 3:45 your time. So that's about 20 minutes. It's not too bad for a question and discussion time. So if we could start with Tim, if you would direct traffic on this. I see already that there's some hands up, and I'll let you.
I saw Al's hand up first here.
Who's that?
Al Burchard.
Okay, Al.
Hi, Darrin. Thanks for your talk. Very informative. I'm wondering if you could say a few more words about intensive livestock operation, and not especially cattle, but hogs and poultry, the use of water, and is there any place for these huge mega operations in any kind of reasonable farming practice? Thank you.
Thanks, Al. Many of the problems with them go beyond climate change, and you mentioned water, and so that's a real problem. On the climate change front, one of the problems with, say, hog mega barns is they're turning very high emission grain that's grown with a lot of nitrogen, fertilizer, etc., into pork in that case. So the emissions are actually quite high. The other problem, of course, is the manure handling, and we've got a lot of emissions coming from that. So I don't think actually the biggest problem with these hog mega barns and industrial operations is climate change. I think probably the bigger problem is water use and other environmental impacts, but they are also a very significant climate change problem.
Okay, thank you. Tim, the next person who had their hand up.
I think that was me. Can you hear me?
Is that Glenn?
Oh, yeah.
I saw Branimir with his hand next.
Oh, okay. No, sorry. Go ahead.
So, Branimir?
Oh, okay. Question I have for Darrin, the number 5 to 10% of the land set aside. How did you calculate that number? Where is that land being taken from, and what's it being used for? The reason I'm asking is there are a lot of land that is already not being intensively used. So it's not being used for intensive monocrop annual production. A lot of land is used for raising cattle extensively, and that land is either carbon neutral, if you're just thinking of carbon, or maybe have some sequestration potential. The reason I'm asking is that Canadian government is proposing 25% to 2025 or 30% to 2030, that we have 30% of protected land. And agriculture could have a large contribution to that protected land through areas that are called other effective conservation measures areas, which could, for example, be, as you mentioned, agroforestry, buffer strips, prairie buffer strips, or extensive cattle production on native or tame land. So just the question, how do you figure it out, that 5 to 10% number? And that is kind of quite a misleading number, maybe, what that land is coming from and what is it going to be used for.
Yeah, thanks, Branimir, for the opportunity to clarify there. I hope the slide said not 5 to 10% of land, but 5 to 10% of cropland. So the grazing land that you're talking about is outside of that. So we're looking at about 5 to 10% of cropland, and that would be the land that is producing the least or that should be restored to wetlands or grasslands, etc. So it doesn't take into account the non-cropland. In terms of set aside, more is better in terms of a climate change solution. But the problem you have is you've got this tension in that when you think of the world's land base, we've got to feed another 3 billion people perhaps. They're trying to proliferate a meat-based diet. There's talk of growing biomaterials to replace plastic. There's talk of growing more biofuels to run jets. There's just a lot, and then even land to grow energy crops for bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. So if you make a list of all the things people think they're going to get off of land, there's going to be tremendous demand on the planetary cropland base. And setting aside even 1 or 2% of cropland is going to be difficult. It's going to be hard to keep land that's currently not in crops from being switched over. So I don't dispute any of the numbers that you brought forward there, but what we're talking about at this point is 5 to 10% of cropland.
Okay, thank you very much for the question and also the answer there. Who would be the next speaker, Tim? And
go ahead.
Who's that?
Glenn.
Okay, Glenn.
Okay, thanks. I did have some faint hope with carbon sequestration in our soil. I've heard from a few sources that we could actually put in more carbon, significantly more carbon than was in the original prairie, because we're adding fertilizer, because we're using deep-rooted crops, and we basically stopped prairie fires. Now, am I just dreaming about that, or is that possible? You're thinking it would top out at the original unbroken prairie, or could we possibly go much higher?
I've just done a review of carbon sequestration, and just about everybody in the world says that these max out. They follow an S curve. And I've even seen quite a few that say you can't get back to that maximum. It's certainly not with a cropping system, because cropping systems they're not nearly as productive and effective in sequestering carbon as grassland. So if you wanted to get back to the level before European settlement in Saskatchewan, you'd have to put it back to grass, and you'd have to let forests regrow. And that's the path to getting back to European levels. So to some extent, I'm overstating. Not only do those pre-settlement periods form the maximum, the scientific consensus is it's hard to get back even close to that maximum if you're using cropping systems rather than grassland and letting forests grow. Now, you mentioned nitrogen. Yeah, nitrogen helps, but as far as I know, no amount of nitrogen is going to get you to carbon levels that exceed what was here before European settlement.
Okay, thanks, Darrin. I'm going to carry that one with me when I get into other conversations.
Okay, thanks, Glenn and Darren. Next speaker, Tim, who do you have in the line?
Stuart Wells.
Okay, Stuart, go ahead, please.
Oh, thanks. Darren, back on the net income graphs, as bad as those graphs look, the situation for the people that are on this at this convention today are a little bit worse probably. And I'm wondering if you could say just a couple of words about what you and Kathy have been trying to track down when it comes to what's included by the government now in the income stream.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Stuart. Kathy's been leading this, but what Stuart's referring to is in the 2019 income data, gross revenue and net income, about 2 billion in gross revenue has been added from cannabis that wasn't there in previous years. And we don't know how much net income, but probably hundreds of millions in net income from cannabis. So we're currently working with StatsCan to get them to report those separately. And just to follow up as well, the other thing, the graph isn't in here, but it's important to this discussion. Debt levels are massive. Canadian debt levels are now over $115 billion. You know, many hundreds of dollars per acre for farmland. So yeah, income levels are very poor and debt levels are rising very rapidly.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Darren and Stuart. The next speaker, Tim.
Brandymere.
Brandymere, go ahead.
Oh, we need to unmute.
Sorry. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Great.
good.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, just to follow up on that question of the increase in the carbon sequestration in grasslands, definitely not cropland, but grasslands, there is a potential there. However, you could increase net primary productivity of native grasslands by, in quote, improving the grasslands with adding legumes for the nitrogen capture, and that would help grasslands grow faster, be more productive, capture more carbon in the root system. However, when you think about the grasslands have developed over thousands of years, and they have a certain balance of plants that are legumes, they're nitrogen, capturing nitrogen. So the question is, in rapidly changing climate, would that resilience of grasslands with increased legumes be really stable or not? So technically, theoretically, maybe it is possible to increase. However, in extreme climate years, what is going to happen? So Darrin, you can maybe comment on that. Because it's not just carbon sequestration, it's the whole resilience of agriculture system and landscapes that we have.
Yeah, thanks for that, Brandymere. You're exactly right. We shouldn't, a number of things. One, we shouldn't just try and see soils and landscapes as sponges for mopping up the carbon coming out of petro-industrial civilization. And too often, certainly I don't think anyone in this meeting, but too often government and some pundits, you know, they calculate how many billion tons you can stuff into the soil. So we need to sort of look at a whole bunch of different aspects and the overall resilience of that soil and those ecosystems. So that's a good point, Brandymere. And in terms of whether you can exceed the initial levels, I'll qualify what I said earlier, and Brandymere's right about adding legumes. It's probably not impossible, and Gabe Brown and Christine Jones and some others have published and sort of point in that direction. And I think in certain places for certain periods of time you can do certain things, but whether you could actually scale that up to include much of the prairie at any given time, given cattle prices and the realities of farms and all of that, it's quite doubtful. So it's not impossible to do it on a limited basis, but whether you could do it over a large area for a long time, and especially as temperatures warm and ecosystems shift and mixes shift and all of that is highly debatable.
Okay, thank you again, Brandemir and Darren. Tim, the next question.
Next up is Kathy.
Okay, Kathy Holtlander.
We need you to be unmuted.
There, hope that's better. Yeah, so I'm just thinking about the nitrogen use and the massive increase in nitrogen use in Saskatchewan. And Darren, you did say you're going to be doing an in-depth study on nitrogen, and if that's the case, I really want to. I'm looking forward to that. But one of the things that I'm thinking probably is driving the increased use of nitrogen is low crop prices, and probably the debt and the low net income situation. That people will use nitrogen to increase yields to make up for lack of price in order to try and maintain an income. And I'm just wondering if is there a place in our climate change work to talk about that, or is that kind of outside of the climate change file? But I think something that maybe as the National Farmers Union, we still need to be bringing in to arguments about, why we should be standing up for better prices for farmers. We don't know how much, we don't have good enough information. It's too hidden as to how much of the value of our crops we don't even see because we're getting underpaid for them. But what do you think about that in terms of the increase in nitrogen use and the dynamics there?
No, I think that's a really good point. It's this odd constellation of farmers trying to figure out how to make a living on prices that don't go up and are often inadequate, coupled with a government focus on maximizing yield and maximizing exports. So yeah, there's a real focus on export maximization, which drives focus on yield maximization, which then drives input maximization. And you're right, if people aren't making enough per bushel, they're going to try and grow more bushels. So I'll look into that for sure. Another thing though too, and just getting back to your initial point, Kathy, about just using more nitrogen and how that relates to carbon sequestration. This is something I forgot to say when we were talking earlier about whether this was Glenn's point, can you use nitrogen to drive soil carbon sequestration levels to those above what existed before European settlement? And one of the things that's very disturbing that the scientific literature shows is as you increase soil carbon levels, nitrous oxide emissions from that same soil go up. And the problem you have is nitrous oxide is 265 times more powerful than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. And you've got all sorts of scientists around the world saying, when you look at the carbon sequestration effect and you look at the nitrous oxide emissions, the nitrous oxide might be offsetting some or all of the carbon sequestration.
Okay, thank you. Do we have another question, Tim? Oh, you muted, Tim.
Lyle Orchard.
Okay, I'm just going to say loud before you begin that on my clock anyway, we got about 5 minutes left for this portion.
I'll keep it brief, Diane. Thanks. Hi, Darren. My question point is kind of on the true cost accounting and as a comparison to organic and big ag. I noticed you had talked about a 2% or some kind of tax on nitrogen fertilizer, which probably farmers would have to pay another weight. But I think if we had a true environmental cost accounting, that what big industrial ag is costing the planet environmentally, compared that to what organic farmers have a potential to contribute. And then if we adjusted the prices we got accordingly, so that as an organic farmer, I could actually depend on enough income in order to yes, have a lower production, such as you pointed out. Because for example, for nitrogen, if I plow down an abundant clover crop, I get a pretty good bang of nitrogen, but I don't get an income that year. So I think we have to really look at how we call what true income based against true environmental costs in the future, and I'm sure that ties into climate change as well. Thanks.
Yeah, Lyle, by coincidence, that's exactly what I was reading from the UN yesterday. They were evaluating analyses of the profitability of organic agriculture. And what they said was, on balance, the study showed that organic agriculture is more profitable than non-organic. But they said, but one of the disadvantages organic agriculture has is it doesn't get to externalize all these other effects on society. So non-organic agriculture is creating depletion, it's creating toxicity, but it doesn't have to internalize any of those costs. And if you somehow did internalize those into non-organic agriculture, the profitability there would be even smaller. So organic agriculture would look even better. So I think that exactly underlines your point.
Hey, thanks, Lyle and Darren. And I wonder if, is that a report link that you could share with the rest of us, Darren? I'd be interested to see that.
Yeah.
That would be great. Tim, are there any other questions in the lineup?
I don't see anyone else.
Yeah, I'll give people another minute or so to click their correct button if they're, I do have a question. And we certainly appreciate your work, Darren, on this this topic, providing this kind of data and information for our presentations and our briefs, and you know, the authenticity of our position. Are there any questions?
Can I just say one? If there's no other questions, can I just say one thing?
Yeah, sure.
And that is that we're working on a whole range of tools and ways that NFU members can help advance this stuff. We're working on sheets in terms of summarizing the policies, giving people kind of notes that they can use if they're writing letters or talking to neighbors, and then also lists of actions that they can undertake to try and help move federal and provincial governments toward policies that are more emission reducing and climate compatible. So look for that in the coming week or two, and we're really going to need the help of all the members in trying to advance these policies, because based on conversations with government, they need to be encouraged to be more ambitious on these fronts.
I like your use of the word.
Final hand from Stuart Wells.
Yeah, Stuart, your question, and that'll be our last one before our next speaker.
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Diane. Darren, back in February, I was reading some articles, and it looks like researchers can tell the difference between new methane and old methane. And so new methane would be methane coming from cattle, for instance. Old methane would be leaking wells that are just has methane drifting into the atmosphere. If that's true, and the proportions are what they look like they might be, with the cattle contribution much lower than the leaking wells, that may offer some hope to cattle producers.
Yeah, absolutely. The methane question is fascinating, and if anybody wants to, there's a series of papers by about 60 authors. The lead author, last name is Saunois, Saunois, and they're trying to figure out the global methane budget. And Stuart's right. It turns out that the emissions from the oil and gas sector have been massively underreported and underevaluated, and this feeds into nitrogen fertilizer, because of course methane and natural gas is the main feedstock. So it is good news for cattle producers. It probably means, though, that we need to even more rapidly scale back oil and gas production. And if we do that, we can not only make room for the emissions from the livestock that should be grazing on grassland, but actually methane's a good news story, because unlike CO2, if you cut back the emissions even 20 or 30%, atmospheric concentrations would actually begin to fall, which isn't the case with CO2. CO2 stays around for hundreds and hundreds of years, but methane is destroyed quite quickly. So a small reduction from livestock and a moderate reduction from the oil and gas sector could actually see one of the three main greenhouse gases start to fall in terms of the atmospheric concentration, and then buy us some time to do some other reductions.